On a warm February evening in 1992, one man's obsession with money, revenge, and betrayal turned an ordinary neighborhood in Florida into a blood-soaked crime scene. Within minutes, 3 people were dead, one man was clinging to life, and a community was shattered forever. Fast forward 33 years later, and that same man, Curtis Windom, walked his final steps into Florida's execution chamber. His last meal was fit for a feast. His final words were garbled and impossible to understand, and his death marked a chilling new record for the state of Florida. But who exactly was Curtis Windom? Why did he kill not 1, but 3 people in a single violent spree? And why did it take more than 30 years for justice to finally be carried out? Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive like this. The story begins on February 7, 1992, in Orange County, Florida. Curtis wasn't just angry, he was obsessed. He believed that a man named Johnny Lee owed him $2,000, and when Windom learned that Lee had recently won $114 at a Greyhound track, his anger turned into cold, violent determination. Windom didn't argue, he didn't try to collect. Instead, he walked into a shop, bought a .38 caliber revolver, loaded it with ammunition, and made a decision that would change lives forever. Minutes later, he spotted Lee standing outside. Without warning, he drove up, pulled out his gun, and shot Lee 2 times in the back. As Lee collapsed, fighting for breath, Windom got out of his car, walked up to him, and fired 2 more shots at point-blank range. It was an execution-style killing, cold, calculated, and final. But Windom wasn't done. This was only the beginning of his rampage, and what happened next would leave 2 more people dead within minutes. After killing Johnny Lee, Windom stormed off toward the apartment of Valerie Davis, his on-again, off-again girlfriend. Their relationship had always been rocky, filled with fights and drama. But on that night, it ended in the most brutal way possible. Windom forced his way inside and fatally shot Valerie Davis. Her screams echoed through the building as neighbors ran for cover, realizing that a gunman was on the loose. Word traveled fast. Valerie's mother, Mary Lubin, had been at work when she heard the devastating news. Her daughter had been shot. Desperate to reach her, she jumped into her car and sped toward the scene. But tragedy was already waiting for her. As she stopped at a stop sign near the apartment complex, Windom walked up to her vehicle. Witnesses later said he leaned into the window, muttered something chilling that no one could clearly make out, and then fired 2 bullets into her chest. Mary Lubin never made it to her daughter. She was gone instantly. By the end of the night, Curtis Windom had killed 3 people he knew personally: Johnny Lee, his girlfriend Valerie Davis, and her mother, Mary Lubin. Another man, Kenneth Williams, was shot and wounded, but miraculously survived. The entire neighborhood had turned into a war zone, and the question everyone was asking was why? Police swarmed the scene, and it didn't take long for Windom to be arrested. He wasn't a mystery man. Everyone knew exactly who had pulled the trigger. Witnesses described his rampage in chilling detail. The trial that followed was straightforward. Prosecutors painted Windom as a cold-blooded killer with no remorse. The jury saw through every attempt by the defense to soften his image. Within months, he was convicted on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The sentence? Death. Windom would be sent to Florida's death row at Rayford State Prison, where he would spend the next 30 years fighting the inevitable. His lawyers tried to argue that he had been given ineffective legal representation, claiming his trial attorney failed to properly defend him. But appeal after appeal was denied. The Florida Supreme Court and later the U.S. Supreme Court refused to overturn his sentence. Still, year after year, Windom managed to delay the inevitable. Until finally, in 2025, the state of Florida signed his death warrant. And after 33 years of waiting, the clock was finally ticking. For over 30 decades, Curtis Windom sat in a cell, watching time crawl by. He was part of Florida's death row population, one of the largest in the nation. Some family members of the victims waited patiently for the day justice would come. Others lost hope that it would ever happen. Meanwhile, Windom's defense team continued filing appeals, desperate to keep him alive. But everything came crashing down in August 2025. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal, sealing his fate. Outside prison walls, debates raged. Supporters of the death penalty said it was about time, that the victims' families had waited far too long. Opponents, including religious groups and activists, argued that executing Windom after so many years was unnecessary and cruel. But Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant anyway. Windom's day of reckoning had come. And on August 28, 2025, the final chapter of his life was written.
On his last day alive, Windom woke up at 5 a.m. Guards reported that he was calm, expressionless, and resigned to his fate. When offered a last meal, he didn't hold back. His plate was stacked with ribs, baked beans, collard greens, potato salad, pie, ice cream, and a soda. It was a Southern feast, one that most people would save for a family cookout, not the final hours of their life. But despite the meal, one thing stood out. Windom had no visitors, no family, no friends. No one came to see him off. His final hours were spent alone. And then came the moment the world had been waiting 33 years for. At 6:02 p.m., the curtains opened and witnesses looked into the execution chamber. Windom was strapped to a gurney, IV lines connected to his arms. His face looked calm, but his last words were mumbled and unintelligible. Nobody in the witness room could make out what he said. The lethal injection began. For a few minutes his chest rose and fell as the drugs flowed into his system. By 6:08 p.m., all movement had stopped. 9 minutes later, at 6:17 p.m., Curtis Windom was pronounced dead. For the families, it was the end of a long wait. Valerie Davis's sister, Camille Hunter, spoke through tears. It took 33 years to get some closure. Justice for her, healing for me. But outside the prison, protesters held signs demanding an end to executions, arguing that taking another life wouldn't bring the victims back. Windom's death wasn't just the end of his story. It became part of Florida's record-breaking year of executions. Windom wasn't the first inmate Florida executed in 2025, and he wouldn't be the last. In fact, his execution marked the 11th for the year, the most Florida has carried out in the modern era. The previous record had been 8 executions in a single year, back in 1984 and again in 2014, but 2025 shattered that number. Among those executed were notorious killers like Cale Bates, Edward Zakrowski, and Glenn Rogers. Each case carried its own dark legacy, but together they signaled something bigger. Florida was ramping up executions at a pace not seen in decades. And the state isn't done. Another death warrant has already been signed for David Pittman, scheduled for execution on September 17, 2025, for murdering 3 members of his estranged wife's family. Florida has become the epicenter of capital punishment in America, and Curtis Windom's execution was the case that pushed it over the edge into record-breaking history. Curtis Windom's story is one of rage, revenge, and wasted life. In 1992, he killed 3 people in cold blood, leaving behind families that would grieve for decades. His victims never got a second chance, and for more than 30 years, their loved ones waited for justice. When it finally came, it raised as many questions as it answered. Was this true justice, or just another killing in a cycle of violence? Did it bring peace, or simply reopen old wounds? One thing is certain: Curtis Windom's crimes left scars that will never heal, and his execution marked not just the end of his story, but a turning point in Florida's death penalty history. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to Death Row Diaries for more deep dives into the darkest cases on death row. Hit the like button if you think justice was finally served in this case, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe executions bring closure, or do they only add more pain? Until next time, this has been Death Row Diaries, where the final chapter is always the darkest.